随着新兴市场的崛起，企业品牌在迈向国际的布局已经越来越重要，而掌握关键的策略，才能够打造具竞争力的世界级品牌，并且将它成为台湾新的制胜王牌。而现在，我们很难能可贵，也请各位再度以热烈的掌声，让我们欢迎亚洲品牌策略大师 Mr. Martin Rowe， 他要为我们分享 Business and Brand Leadership: A New Approach to Global Success for Taiwanese Business. Let's welcome to Mr. Martin Rowe， 让我们掌声欢迎 Mr. Martin Rowe。
Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much to the Taiwanese government, to the organizers, the media outlet, and also to all of you for being here this morning for the next 2 days. I'm very happy to open the conference of power branding, a topic which is very close to my heart. When the organizers asked me to come in, and I said, Martin, we'll give you 50 minutes. I kind of asked for 3 weeks. That was denied. So we had tried to kind of compress kind of my view of branding and the Asian challenges into hopefully a very interesting 15-minute presentation on that topic. So if we start to dive into it, McKinsey & Company, the management consulting firm, they wanted to find out a few years back what are the parameters of the most successful Asian enterprises. And not surprisingly, these businesses focused on human resources, networks, and brands. Very good. Those were the most Asian profitable businesses. The bad news were that there were only a very few profitable Asian businesses when you compare to the global peers. And if you think about it in my world, because I call it strong brands, and that's what we're going to talk about this morning, I would argue that outside Japan and Korea, still, there are only or less than 10 Asian global brands outside Japan and Korea. Why is that? Why is it that Asian businesses had not moved up the chain, which we're going to talk about this morning and over the next 2 days? What held them back? Don't they have the mindset? Don't they have the capabilities? What is it that should make Asian brands, Asian firms, Taiwanese businesses to move up the value chain? That's what we're going to talk about this morning. But try to look at it before we get too brutal on what has not happened yet in Asia. Asia came from a low-cost paradigm. It used to be a fantastic advantage for Asian businesses, including businesses from Taiwan for sure, and you still enjoy that. There is a certain kind of parameter of low cost. There was huge volumes in Asia. That's what created the first and second tier Asian family firms, where you just turned over huge volumes of goods at very low margins. The China, the Indian economy obviously served this big market, but there was not so much focus on innovation. If you look back in 1996, China spent 0.6% of GDP on innovation. And some of the latest numbers suggest that they're coming into the 2.4, 2.6%, where Japan and Korea, US had traditionally spent at least 3.2 to 3.4% of innovation, of GDP on innovation. Huge diversified conglomerates meant that, yes, businesses were big. You go back to Samsung 20 years ago, Samsung had their hands dipped into any pie of businesses: retail, shipyards, electronics, semiconductors, household appliances, everything. But somehow when you have a very diversified portfolio, it's very hard to build a brand, because nowadays you have to be distinctly unique, very well positioned. You have to be known for exactly that, in exactly that industry. It's very hard to build up a brand that encapsulates everything for everyone. And then lastly, excess capacity. In many, many industries, many markets in Asia, overseas even, we have seen a huge excess capacity. So a good argument were for years that Asian business leaders kind of felt like, yeah, but I'm kind of tempted to go in, but how can I protect my margin? And then lastly, you see that here, maybe lack of IP and trademarks. The funny thing is, China, for a start, and many other countries in Asia, they don't really lack the, sorry, the IP and the trademark paradigm. They actually have all the laws in place. But what sometimes have been lacking is the law enforcement. So it's not because we don't have the laws, but we need someone to say, wait a minute, we need to make a serious effort on the government level throughout our institutions of enforcing trademarks, because that's the only way we can foster local entrepreneurs to step up to build brands, but also getting the global big businesses to set up brands in our country and take that market seriously. That has held back many businesses for years, and they have been struggling with that. But that's somehow where Asia came from. But why should we do all this? Because if you look at it, what actually put things in a nutshell, if you look at the left-hand side, that was a typical Asian manufacturer that earned maybe $5 or $10, $3 to $5 on producing a sports shoe, and then it somehow got shipped to someone else. They moved up the value chain, they sold the goods to other people, and people got that margin, which you see here is a blue box. So someone else got that profit that potentially that product, that item could have commanded, but at least the Asian businesses did not get that. And that's what we're going to talk about today. How do we move Asian businesses from the left-hand side of the paradigm into the right-hand side? Because very often today, marketing tends to be pretty technical. It tends to be a function, something very isolated, something that we allocate a cost to. It's a cost center, instead of being an investment that potentially would move from the P&L to the balance sheet as an asset. And that's a totally different way of looking at a brand, where a brand becomes something which is much more organizational-wide, led by the CEO. I'm going to get back to that. Something that becomes brand equity, something which of a much, much higher purpose, much higher nature for the businesses. But the reason why we do that has a couple of implications for management, because surely it needs to foster a very good return. I think basically if you do brands and branding very well, you actually have these four outcomes here. First of all, it fosters great value. There's a lot of debate about shareholder value these years. I think it is a catalyst for better leadership. I'll show you a case story on Singapore Airlines in the end of my presentation. And I think actually having that common purpose, the common vision that everyone knows very well about, that actually enables much better leadership from the top of the company throughout the organization. It gets throughout. And then yet, which I think marketers have been blamed for years, yeah, but new things kind of tend to work long term. I still think if you have strong brands, and you're a retailer, and you're an electronics firm, you're an airline, where you had to protect your quarterly results, you had to protect your margins, you had to protect your short-term results, you can actually balance that by having strong brands. But that's where marketeers for years have been boxed in to be a cost center where we couldn't really see the outcome, we couldn't see the result of it. So if you want to build a strong brand, if Asian businesses really want to capture this immense opportunity, I have to say, I think three things have to be present in the organization. And that sometimes becomes a bit of a tedious discussion when I walk into my clients, often for the first time, and I start to think about this, because in their mind, we're just going to build the brand right away. They are going to a trade exhibition in Frankfurt in 3 weeks' time, and they just need to rebrand. And I keep telling them it starts at a totally different level. It starts with a very, very different mission, because you need to have these three things in place. You need to have strong innovation, needless to say. Are we just going to copy what other people have been doing? Are we going to replicate what other people do? Are we just going to get inspired for what they do? Somehow, we need to have something that matters to the world. You also need to have a strong culture. That's about skills, values, your comfort zone, where we're pushing people out of the comfort zone every day. And culture is very, very hard to build. It's easy to destroy. But if you do it well, that's when you're going to take you through the journey. And lastly, leadership and strategy. Try to think of the three of them. You can have an immense management team. You can have a very good strategy in place. You can have great products, but if you don't have the cultural deliverable, I don't think you're going to survive for a long time. You can have fantastic products, it can have a culture, but if you don't have a heading, if you don't have a bearing, a purpose, a long-term vision, it's not going to take you there either. If that somehow forces us to think about brands not only from the marketing department's perspective, try to look at this box here, and sorry for all the detailed lines, but you can see you've been giving all my slides, and I want you, once you get back into the office, to actually do remember what I told you. Some speakers get on stage and they have one word for 1 hour, and it just says empowerment, and after tomorrow, day after tomorrow, you can't really remember it. So here you have a little more detail here. What I meant to say is that, yes, the boardroom is set in this world to do the following. You see it here, we were through it before. And traditionally, which is the lowest box, those are the typical KPIs for marketing. Brand awareness, brand equity, different PR, communication metrics, and so forth. But we need to look at the brand if we want to make sure we get leadership, innovation, and culture in place, which I think are the 3 most important parameters for a modern corporation that wants to build brands and protect their brand successfully. We need to look at those KPIs for anyone else throughout the organization. For example, if you're in operations, what does it mean to have a strong brand? The way you procure, the way you collaborate, maybe with other people, other businesses. If you're the HR director for a big Asian manufacturer, are you able to get the right talent? Does it matter that you have a strong brand? Needless to say, we probably know it does, but it's something we need to make it visible for the HR director. I'll give you a personal anecdote. When I graduated from INSEAD, I went for an MBA to one of the global business schools very late in my career back in '99. Samsung from Korea came on a hiring spree. Samsung would have hired anyone that wanted to work for Samsung. You could have come to Seoul for 2 years to work in the chairman's office, which is called the Global Strategy Group, GSG, a legendary internal consulting firm that advises and sits next to the chairman. Anyone could have gotten a job with Samsung. How many people took it up? We were 750 students. 5 people went back to Korea, all of them native Koreans, 2 of them newly married, had to go back to the country. So if you were the HR director for Samsung at that time, which 13, 14 years ago, did not have the brand, did not enjoy that brand equity that you see today, it's very, very hard to be in HR. Whereas today, Samsung get a huge number of applicants, and they get some of the best hits in the world. It is not difficult for Samsung as a brand today to attract the right people. And you can walk through all the different things, the purchase department. What does it mean for them if you're an airline? If you're Singapore Airlines, and you're going to purchase fuel contracts, insurance, wines, and so forth, does it matter to you to have a strong brand? Yes, it does. And that's where marketing has to come out of marketing. Marketing has to become strategy. And that's why you can see in the different boxes, I have interpreted what those KPIs, for a start, actually means for your businesses. And that's the discussion that has to take place at the highest level. Because that's my second point this morning. How many of you would have a chief marketing officer in the boardroom? Not just in your company by title. And by the way, I don't worry too much about titles, because titles are kind of easily created that doesn't always have the same empowerment. What I'm talking about is that we once and for all elevate marketing to the boardroom. Most companies, if not all companies these days, would have marketing people. But how many of them would have a marketing person, CMO title or VP, senior VP, whatever, head of marketing and communication, to actually sit in the boardroom? Think how many of you would have, for sure, a CEO, a CFO, a CTO, a CXO, a lot of titles in the C-suite these years, but not many businesses will have a CMO. And the reason why that person has to be there is that marketing cannot be an isolated discussion, because traditionally, and still in many firms, marketing are people that are called into the boardroom for a half-day session, maybe a one-day session if they're lucky, and they're asked to leave again. I'm talking about bringing marketing in an equally legged triangle, where marketing is as important as the CFO, and could potentially even be a contender to be the CEO one day, because that's very often the CFO or the CTO. And particularly in Asia, where there's a traditional emphasis on engineering education and financial education, it has been very hard for marketers to prove it. Now, just want to pace ourselves, this is not only an Asian challenge. Only 2 to 3% of the Fortune 500 would have a CMO in the boardroom. The fact is, and the truth is, it's an incredibly hard function to integrate, because marketing is under scrutiny. But I think the only way to move forward is actually go the journey full out, get marketing in there. Marketing also has to be accountable. You still got to have your marketing department. You look at central marketing in Samsung, in Suwon, South Korea, they have 850 people in central marketing. There are a lot of people in there, but you need marketing to be represented at the highest level. And that's also what Samsung did. Mr. Lee Kun-hee, the chairman, he decided already in 1998, where Samsung were forced to change after the Asian financial crisis, he actually created, probably as one of the first ones in Asia, the CMO function. And I think that has helped Samsung extremely well. So what does it take to build a brand? Aside from bringing the discussion into the boardroom, it takes 3 different things. You need to have the right resources, the right skills, and the right mindset. When it comes to resources, I'm asked very often, yeah, but Martin, we are a $20 million company. We are a $10 million company. We do not have the marketing budget of the IBMs and the McDonald's and the Nikes and the L'Oreals, the BMWs of the world. We can't afford it. And I very often tell them, you're actually in a fantastic position because you don't necessarily need the big marketing budgets. What you need is to do, you have to do what you do very well. Think about the Singapore luxury resort chain Banyan Tree, which is a very small luxury hotel chain based out of Singapore, grew over the last 20 years. They never really advertised, but nevertheless have become one of the leading boutique firms in the world in the hospitality industry, just by doing what they did extremely well. Think about Starbucks. Have you ever seen an ad from Starbucks? Starbucks never really advertised, but they made people come to the stores, got a good experience, and they started to talk about it. That's how Samsung grew. So resources should not be the barrier in Asia for brand building. What about the skill sets? As I said, back to INSEAD in 1999, at that time it was almost an insult to suggest to young MBA students at Harvard, Stanford, anywhere in the world to come back to Asia. And I was kind of puzzled. Why do you go back to Korea? Why do you return to Singapore, to Taiwan, to China? There are all these opportunities. No. We're going to join the IBMs and the McKinseys and the Nikes and the L'Oreals. A lot of them went to Silicon Valley, pre-.com, I have to admit. And also the senior leaders did not come back. They had great positions with Cisco. They worked overseas in global corporations, so-called global corporations. But now, 13, 14 years later, all the young people have come back. A lot of skills have returned to Asia. And also the senior people, I know in Mandarin that's a term for sea turtle. So all the senior elders, as you wish, 40 plus, have returned to Asia with a lot of skill sets, a lot of experiences. And they are probably already, at this point of time, very well infused into the Asian corporations. But what you need to have is the right mindset. And that's a trigger point. How much of a mindset do I need? Very often in conferences and my classroom teachings, among my clients, I'm asked, yeah, but Martin, how do I measure my mindset? I said, it's very hard to help you because it's something you have to make up yourself. Because I can give you all the resources. I can give you all the skill sets. We can run through all the case stories. I'll give you all the Harvard professors you need and all the cases from Harvard and Stanford, whatever. Let's look at all the wrongdoings, all the right doings, best experiences and insights. Big data. We have so much at our disposal these years. But if you don't believe in that journey, it's not going to take you anywhere. That's where it starts. Try to look at this little journey here. Here's a white and a black product. Needless to talk about the white product, which has moved on dramatically over the last 10 or 15 years, doing quite well as of now. But try to look at the black product. I don't know whether any one of you are familiar with the black product. Have you heard about it? Have you ever seen it? The Zen Micro. Zen Micro came from a company called Creative Technologies in Singapore. Back in the 90s, Creative was a darling on the Singapore Stock Exchange, a fantastic technology firm that actually produced that black product. Now, if you look at the black product, it has great talk times, long battery hours, fantastic sound, a lot of storage, great menu, it's dust-proof, waterproof, it's all in all a very, very sturdy product. Now, why didn't the black product ever become the white product? What went wrong here? Because it was a fantastic piece of technology. I think what went wrong in a nutshell were that the owner and the management behind the black product failed to realize that people don't buy technology. Nobody in this world buys technology. Nobody. Apple consumers do not buy technology. People that fly on an airline do not buy technology. People that buy mobile phones, food, anything. People don't buy the product in itself. If you source services and products from IBM, Cisco, and so forth, you don't buy products. You buy reliability, ease of life, peace of mind, a better life, whatever that is, but you don't buy products. And what the management in creative fail to understand is that people do not buy technology. They buy anything else, and that's what the white product understood. And that's where Asia has to get the mindset right, and that's why we have to bring this discussion into the boardroom. Try to do this example here. Nothing to teach about the brand on the right-hand side, but if you think about the brand on the left-hand side, Li-Ning from China, the sports apparel company, Mr. Li-Ning was a hero in China, is a hero. He won 9 medals at the Los Angeles Olympics in 1984, came back to China and founded Li-Ning. They wanted to take on Nike, so they raised close to 100 million Hong dollars 8 years ago on the Hong Kong exchange because they wanted to take on the world. They did defend the territory in China, I have to say, but in order to move up, you really have to stand for something else. You cannot just copy what other people have doing. Without saying Li-Ning is copying what Nike is doing, you have to find that differentiation that's really going to make you stand out, and you probably have to look a little different too in the making. So the fact is today that Li-Ning is still a mixed bag, despite a fantastic legacy and fantastic start, a fantastic home, and a great story around it. Could probably, if histories have shown it, have taken Li-Ning to a different place than they were today. So somehow in this journey, and that's where the mindset starts, and what can we learn from Steve Jobs? I think we can learn a few lessons and a couple of things that we should not do, but he kind of said that you somehow know it already. You need to follow your heart and your intuition, because somehow deep inside, they somehow know what you truly want to become. And that's why this journey is not only about copying what other people have done. It's not a linear fashion. It's not about saying, we are in this particular industry. I look at my best benchmarks, being an Asian firm or a Western firm. Many manufacturers in Asia these years, many other people, they try to replicate Apple for a start. A lot of people try to learn everything from Apple. How do they do it? I want to be as Apple. This is not about being like Apple. Almost forget about the Western firms. Forget about all the other guys on the market, competitors. Learn from them, get inspired from them, but somehow you have to create your own journey, and that's where the mindset comes into full power. It takes a bit of soul searching, and it's a journey. It is not done in a 1 or 2 day workshop. It is a journey, but it can be done. Many companies have done it. Because what you really have to do, and that's where I put leadership as one of the most important things, is, yeah, in order to qualify, you need to have some functional attributes. Think about the black product. You need to have a couple of points where you differentiate. You're faster, longer battery hours, more outlets, sweeter foods, whatever you have, anything that makes you different. Just be careful. People can copy you, and in a very complex, transparent world, copied products are just emerging almost overnight these days. It's very hard to protect even your patents, your trademarks, and everything. You need to keep that innovation machine humming. That's why I had innovation as one of the 3 points in my triangle. And people forget that. Just because I was successful 3 years ago or during this season, think about the fashion firm, think about Inditex Zara from Spain. They have 85 collections a year, 30,000 SKUs. You simply have to keep innovating all the time, even though you are probably the leading player in the fashion industry. So you also need to create, in my last column, some emotional value. That's where culture comes in. That's where you're known for something which is not just something I can measure, something I can taste, I can see. I can look at a white paper and see the technical aspects of it. We still need to have it. But the emotional values is something that you cannot just build overnight. And that's also sometimes very hard for Asian business leaders to understand, that you can't enforce it. And the best comparison I can make is that it's a bit like a bottle of wine. You can get a very young Beaujolais, but if you want to have a very seasoned, rounded, well-bodied wine, it simply needs to take years to nurture and refine itself. And brands are the same thing. maybe except from a few technology brands from the US that have emerged, including Asia, in a few years span of time. But in general, brands takes time. If you want to build that legacy, you want to have those legs to stand on, it's going to take you at least 3 to 5 years, if not longer. And that's a challenging thing, because we might be beyond the CEO's tenure. We might be beyond the CMO's tenure and other people in the organization. And that's why culture comes into place, because culture is not necessarily going to change just by the fact that we get a new CEO into the boardroom. And if you do all this right, which you see here in a very simplified model, that's where a brand starts to come to life. So you need to differentiate, and you also have to be a little proud of your roots. Try to think about this company. I don't know whether you're familiar with it. Sorry. It's a Korean cosmetics firm. It's called Amore Pacific. It's founded back in the 30s. They did more ingredients for pharma and for the pharmaceuticals in the early years, but over the last 20, 25 years have turned into a challenger brand in the cosmetic space. We know they have the legacy brands of the L'Oreals, the Estée Lauders, the Shiseido from Japan, but what you see from Amore Pacific here is a company with 11 different homegrown brands that never acquired anyone. They built their own brand from scratch. One of them, you see it here, is Laneige, which is distinctly Korean. It has a lot of ingredients. Distinctly Korean. Have built Laneige, which is an upper mid-tier brand, to become one of the fastest growing cosmetics brands in China, which is a tough thing. You got Oil of Olay, you got Estée Lauder, you got L'Oreal, you got Shiseido, all the players, like in any other industry, that have been focusing immensely on the Chinese cosmetics market, which is poised to be one of the biggest in the future. But nevertheless, that little Korean firm, because they are very small in comparison, they are tiny compared to just Shiseido, which is one of the smaller ones. Nevertheless, by using that type of Koreanness, a differentiation in terms of products and the ingredients, they have green tea from Jeju and have other ingredients from the soils of Korea, plus simply a different story to the product, they have actually made an inroad to China in order to differentiate and not just saying we're going to be like the other ones, we're going to keep somehow where we're coming from and what makes us very distinct from Korea. So that's also very important to take note of. And it's kind of something that we have been through in the first part of the speak. You have to find your own identity. I think there has been this thrust in Asia that we're just going to be like the Western brands. We're going to be like somehow the global brands. And sometimes in that making, we forget about our roots. Many global firms have done the same thing. Samsung, for a start. The last 10 years, Samsung did not really want to talk about Korea. They considered at some point in time even to move the headquarters to New York City, to move away from Seoul. Why? Because we're going to learn from the best Western practices. And I think they realized you can't escape your roots. And your roots are actually very, very good to have. It's a bit like a relationship. You can get acquainted. You can become friends. But if you want to really fall in love, you want to build that very strong bond between a consumer, customer, and a brand, I need to know where you're from. I need to know your roots. Nobody would question a car from Germany. Nobody would question cosmetics from France, fashion from Italy, dreams from Hollywood. But no one should question technology and a consumer brand from Korea either. And that surely has to do with country branding. Try to look at Shanghai Tang here. They have been very true to the Chinese roots, the Hong Kong Chinese roots. Still a mixed bag. They're still learning to get things right. But somehow, despite the fashion element, despite the modernity that is blended with the tradition and history, they still have not ran away from where they're coming from, which is China. The Chinese roots of the Chinese diaspora. They kind of allude back to the Chinese, to China and Shanghai in the 20s. Try to look at Uniqlo. As global as Uniqlo now is becoming, if you walk into the stores, there are some very unique, distinct Japanese things about the store in terms of the service levels, in terms of the colors, the shop decor, the way you are greeted. There are small elements of Japan. It does not mean they kind of wave the flag all over. It's still a global firm and they appeal to many, many cultures, but somehow if you look at the service offerings and what they really stand for, they have never forgotten the roots where they come from. And that goes back to country branding. So as right as Samsung probably were in the beginning to say we are a global firm, but then realized in the making that no one is global. Everyone has a home. I think they somehow came back home and realized, also because the country perception of Korea in terms of quality, service levels, just the basic knowledge for global citizens about what Korea stands for, actually also emerged over the last 10 or 15 years. And so the same thing about Taiwan. Look at your industries. It almost has come in batches. Every decade, Taiwan has moved on. This country was in a very different place 20, 30, 40 years ago. Whereas where you are today, nobody would question the quality of Taiwan, which I think is a discussion that's going to be inherent throughout the next 2 days and surely in our panel later as well. There is something about the country brand that one shouldn't escape, could not escape and should not escape, because it's actually going to benefit you. In the end, you can't hide where you're from, and you shouldn't. But now, if we get all this right, many brands have gotten it right over the years, there is a tendency that we become arrogant and complacent. I know these are very, very strong words. Am I blaming management to potentially become arrogant and complacent? Yes, I do. It can happen to anyone. It can happen to a fashion firm. It can happen to a technology firm, a mobile company, a government. Anyone can become arrogant and complacent. I grew up with Adidas, the German sports apparel brand. They were a darling in the 70s and the 80s, but where did they go in the 90s? They almost disappeared from the surface of Earth. Weren't they great? They were fantastic. But someone took bad decisions. And they reinvigorated it, and the Adidas came back. But they were probably so successful, so they kind of forgot a bit about the purpose. They forgot to innovate. Maybe they did not have the right leadership in place. And maybe the culture has just faded. It has not been nurtured, because culture has to be nurtured. You have to be a gardener as a CEO. You need to make sure that the culture is always upbeat and up and running. And that's very important. Think about yourself. How many of you would have a Nokia phone 5 years ago? Most of you are lying. I think everyone had a Nokia, right? It was such a great brand. But what happened to Nokia? 5 years ago, they were all over the place. What happened? Do we blame technology changes? Was it the market someone else's fault? Once you are very successful, you start to lower your bar, you start to lower your own expectations, you start to lower R&D, you come a little blinded about the future development, and it might not go in that direction you think. It might actually go to the left or to the right. That's where arrogance and complacency strikes. It can strike at any given moment, and even the most successful businesses that you see today, which you do admire, it can happen for them too. It can happen for you. That's why I brought a little brand here from my home country, Singapore Airlines. Not because we're going to discuss right or wrongdoings by an airline. I'm not here to promote an airline. Forget about Singapore Airlines as an aviation company. Think about Singapore Airlines as a services company. Think about Singapore Airlines as one of the strongest brands in the world. It is surely on my list outside Japan and Korea for the 10 Asian global brands. Singapore Airlines has an interesting story, because for a few years, they ran a joint airline with Malaysia, Malaysian Singapore Aviation Systems. But in 1968, 3 years after Malaysia or Singapore were kicked out of the Malaysian Federation, Lee Kuan Yew, the founding father of Singapore, he was kicked out of Malaysia, and Singapore had to be on its own. Singapore in the late 60s had close to nothing. It was almost a swamp. A lot of malaria, Chinese gangs, violence, ethnic minorities, a lot of conflicts. It was not a nice place back in the 60s. Nevertheless, they decided to move on. And in 1968, they decided to break away from the common airline, from the airline they shared with Malaysia. And the government decided to create an airline with the best service in the world. And they worked on it for 5 years. And in October 1973, the Singapore Girl came to life. And this is the first ad that ran in October 1973. With a very small budget, by the way. And the Singapore Girl were not the Singapore Girl at that time, because it was just a claim. It was somehow running the risk of just being an empty promise. Beautiful as she is, but with a claim of delivering a great way to fly, that is still to be proven. Now, that could have ended up being a business that would not take off, because the Singapore Girl could have been just an empty promise, which is the left-hand side of my diagram. But what you need to do when you run any successful brand, you need to deliver as well. And I think maybe this is where Asia has a major challenge and a huge opportunity. Because many businesses would shout loud on very shallow ground, which would be a brand promise. We all claim better services, we are faster than the nearest competitor, we are better, more reliable, whatever. but can you deliver on that promise? I think Asia is in a position, because of your technology, because of your innovation and the focus on Asia as a region, a lot of things are actually being delivered, but many Asian businesses fail to move up and build a promise. That's a different challenge. It's difficult too, it's very complex, but it's a better position to be in instead of shouting loud on shallow ground. So what Singapore Airlines did were, they focused a lot on brand delivery. And probably the smallest delivery you can think of, which is a freshly brewed coffee made on an Italian coffee machine. It was installed for the first time in 1975. And you might think about, Martin, talking about freshly brewed coffee. Yeah. At that time, years ago, it was very difficult to brew coffee in an aircraft. Because of the pressure in the cabin, which were less pressurized than you have it today, there were a lot of security concerns dealing with hot steam in high altitude, security regulations, but also the way that you would roast and you would brew the coffee has to be done in a different way. So Singapore Airlines called what I call the coffee engineers from Italy. And they came to Singapore, installed the machines together with Boeing on the first aircraft. That would have been a point of difference back to my diagram, but I'm sure that half a year later, the leading global players would have copied the coffee. But nevertheless, for half a year or close to a year, Singapore Airlines took ownership of having actually a very fresh coffee on board. Just a small thing. They introduced a hot towel. They even tried to patent it, but that was denied because you can't patent a hot towel because it was deemed by authorities or the trademark people to be a little too generic. So instead, they trademarked the perfume of the hot towel, which is not the perfume of the cabin crew. Cabin crew is not allowed to wear perfume. They had to be neutral. But if you take the scent of the hot towel, it's called St. Florian's Waters, and it's patented in 14 trademark classes worldwide. That shows the length that how far you will go to try to protect what you're building up. They have launched a lot of aircraft over the years. They were one of the first ones to take on the 747. They were the first one and the only one to ever fly the Concorde between London and Singapore, which only lasted for 8 years due to noise regulations. They were one of the biggest customers of the 777 when it came out in the early 90s, one of the legacy aircraft in the modern long-haul aviation. And 5 years ago, exactly, 5.5 years ago, they took delivery of the first Airbus 380. And you would think, yeah, what's so much about it? Yeah, but they were the first one to take ownership. And you know, in Europe, I'm European, I come from Denmark, we can't really collaborate in Europe because this Airbus is a patchwork of different countries coming together to produce an Airbus, which took a little longer than we expected. I think it was delayed 3, 4, or 5 years. So surely with a lot of penalty for the better of Singapore Airlines. But when it finally came live, I think this was a blessing for Boeing, or for Airbus, but also for Singapore Airlines. Why? Because when the first aircraft flew from Singapore to Sydney in September, you had the entire world press being present for an event that you did not even pay for. Singapore Airlines did not pay $1 for that. I'm sure all the services contracts are now free due to the late delivery. But you got the entire world press covering a technology frontier shift that would happen anyway because the 380 would come whether Singapore Airlines wanted it or not. And they got all the coverage to be the first one. The funny thing is, they're not even the biggest customer of the 380. Singapore Airlines got the first 19. They bumped it up to 26. And the Emirates Airlines from Dubai has an option on 144 380s. They are by far a bigger customer. But the global media press has never covered a single takeoff of Emirates, or Lufthansa, or Air France, or anyone else, because you had to be the first one to move the technology frontier. And that's where Singapore Airlines, from small things from a coffee to the 380, have been very good to focus on the delivery side, to balance the promise and the delivery. And that's where businesses forget about it all the time. And that's where marketing and brands cannot only reside in the marketing function. It has to be much, much wider in terms of a strategy mindset, as we talked about also. Another thing they're very good at is to manage the touch points. Because I can claim to be a great way to fly. I can put all the service deliveries in place, buy the right aircraft, procure the right wine, the right oil contracts, fly to the right airports at the right time at the right price. But it's also about the touch points. And you had to do that right. Think about what can go wrong on an airline. Missed luggage, don't get the flight, too expensive, grumpy service, no white wine, spill on your suit, whatever can go wrong. Anything can go wrong on an airline. They are very good at managing the touch points. Give you one example. I flew some years back from London to Asia on long haul. And as I give a lot of speaks, I would normally just check in my luggage because you're supposed to be up early in the next morning. I checked it in London, arrived to Singapore, and the luggage was broken, almost run over by a truck. So I complained to Singapore Airlines in the morning, 5:30, a little tired. And she said, here's a bag, Mr. Roll, bring back your bag and all your belongings, whatever is left of it, and we'll repair it. Went to my office at 9, had a shower, went to my office, and there was no sign of a bag. So I called Singapore Airlines, and 20 minutes later, they picked up the bag, and I went off to a meeting. Came back at 6 o'clock, and on the office floor was something wrapped in bubbly plastic, and I unwrapped it. Same brand, same size, different color, brand new. Most importantly, there was a small card from Singapore Airlines, and it was handwritten. As a marketeer, you check it. I don't want to have some kind of HP pre-inkjetted, dear Mr. Customer equals nobody. This was written by mankind. Mrs. Chin. Dear Mr. Roll, here's your bag, new color. I hope you like it. If not, let me know and I'll change it. Most importantly, I have checked you in on your preferred window seat tomorrow morning to Jakarta on SQ91C, on your preferred seat on 14K. Have a nice flight. Best regards, Mrs. Chin. Is that because Mrs. Chin likes me? No, never met her. She was not in the airport. She was not on the hotline. She's surely in Singapore, because if not, you cannot write up this card in a matter of 8 hours. But that's part of the SOP, standard operating procedures. If something goes wrong, spend $80 on the passenger, it doesn't matter, and I'm here 6 years later, I'm still using this story. Why? Because this is not up to Mrs. Chin to decide whether she's empowered to have $40 or $1,000 when something goes wrong. You put it in your SOPs. This is where the secret of delivery comes to light, and many, many companies forget that. Because in most common Asian firms, we need to wake up the chairman in the morning to ask for $60. It doesn't work that way. You have to empower the front line. In Singapore Airlines, which is a company of 18,000 people, it just happened to happen in a seamless fashion all over the world real time, because one intricacy of an airline is they keep operating around the world 24/7. Someone has to be empowered. We do not have to call up management back in Singapore when something goes wrong. And that's why they go a long way to get people through the funnel here. And you go all the way to what I call the care-wise, because when you get into, think about your job, the first job you got, you know what to do. It takes you a while to get accustomed to your first job. You know how you do it. You start to translate it into advanced skills and using your skills, and you end up knowing why you do it. This is exactly why you were hired, to be part of that job in the first place. That's exactly what you're paid for. Your boss is very happy. You'll get your bonus. You are complying 100% with what you're being asked to do. But what you want to do in a company is you want to have success plus outperformance, which is what you refer to as care-wise. And successful brands make sure they also employ care-wise. It doesn't mean that everyone becomes a care-wise, because the far majority of everyone in an organization end up being no-wise. That's exactly what you're employed to do, and we're very happy with that. We just need to make sure that we instill a bit of care-wise throughout the organization. Another example from Singapore Airlines. I flew a couple of years back on a 747, one of the old aircraft, and in the middle of the night, passing the Middle East, I think over Afghanistan somewhere where there's a bottleneck, all the long-haul flights had to congest that in that space because of the wind. So during the night, everyone's supposed to sleep, and suddenly a baby wakes up, which is, I guess, a young mom's worst nightmare. To keep awake on Singapore Airlines, 460 passengers that are supposed to sleep. And she was devastated. And in a matter of seconds, which I think for passengers felt like half an hour, but it was literally 40 seconds, one of the stewardesses emerged, took the baby out of the cradle, and disappeared. As a marketer, you're very curious, right? I was asleep as well, but I want to see what happened. So I started the young mom. She went to the toilet, got herself together, went back to her seat, and fell asleep again. No baby. Okay. So I walked back to the pantry, all the way back in the back of the 747. And during the night, there's a very low maintenance because everyone is supposed to sleep. If you kind of figure out during the night on long haul, they lower the temperature between 3 to 5 degrees. It gets colder for a reason. First of all, it saves fuel. 2, it makes you sleep because you're going to bump up in your blanket. And half of the cabin crew is supposed to sleep under the rudder where you have some bunkets up there. So I came into the pantry, and the first thing I spotted was a little baby on the white towel, having a great time, smiling. They probably gave it a bit of white wine. And I came in and everyone, oh, good evening, Mr. Roll. Do you want a glass of wine, cup of tea? I said, no. I want to know one thing. Is that part of the standard operating procedure? And they just cracked open laugh when I said that. I said, of course, it was the least we could have done. It's not. We're not taught to do that. Point taken. Got my tea, went back to sleep. Woke up the next morning. Baby was back, happy, sleeping in the cradle. What was that all about? Was it part of the SOP? No, it was not. I've later checked with Singapore Airlines. They are not supposed to do that. You're welcome to do it. You have to be a little careful about turbulence, holding another family's baby. But somehow that's a care why, because that's where 2 + 2 becomes 5 in an organization, where people say, yeah, we know why to do it, but we also care about it. We know the cultural values. We know the purpose of the airline. We know what Singapore Airlines stands for. We feel it. It's so part of our heart and our DNA. So on the spot, we will react when something happens. And in this case, a baby crying, which I think is not a novelty. It probably happens on all aircraft anyway. But you do something about it. I very often say, if this has happened on a Western carrier, an American airline, the family would have sued the airline for touching their baby. We don't do that in Asia. We actually deliver great hospitality and very, very warm service. So that's part of the touch points too, that you're gonna go so far so your culture and your organization know how to deliver on those strong points. And if you do all of that, it actually does pay back. It pays back because you get better share of wallet, better premium, and you got also much, much better brand equity and brand satisfaction. So you create that kind of stickiness and that bond that I talked about in the beginning with your customers. And if you want to do it, it really requires a global mindset. One thing is to do it in one market, in one culture, but think about an airline, think about a technology business, think about a Samsung, which is now out there. It really requires a global mindset, and that's also what the founder of Infosys realized many, many years ago. You cannot necessarily just do it the Indian way. As good as they are in technology and in services and all of that, in order to expand that offering to compete on with very, very different competitors, you really need to have that mindset that makes you understand what are all the cultural differences once you get into it. And that's why Asia, to kind of start to sum it all up, Asia has to find out whether Asia wants to continue getting better. So we spend only a little piece on creating and learning. Learning here is very, very important because, yes, we're going to create something that's going to take us into the future. We might even try to do something which has not been seen before. Many people have done it. But we also learn from that. We learn from our own journey, but we also learn from competitors. We can get inspired by what other people have done. Surely, if you want to compete in an industry, why don't we just study the benchmarks for a start? That's a very good beginning of your compass. And then we execute. But as I said a little earlier, a brand is a promise and a strong delivery. And I do think that Asian businesses are fairly good on the delivery side. You have great technology. There's a lot of innovation taking place. Skills have come back. Resources are in place. Most Asian businesses have a lot of cash. That's another thing. You started the balance sheets of most Asian businesses being family-owned or chapel-owned or partly government-sponsored, whatever. They have more or less some pretty solid balance sheets. So the excuse about not being able to maybe get a little more learning and creation going is going to fall flat in a management discussion. Now, the thing is, are we going to focus in Asia to become different? Because that's going to be very, very daring to do that. We cannot just forecast in a linear fashion and just keep executing. Yes, we're going to execute very well. The quality has to be there. We have to have the speed. We need to have the reliance and the safety, whatever you're going to put in the execution box, being able to deliver anywhere in the world for other people. But if you want to take ownership of that journey, that's about creating something which is truly different. And that is simply about reorganizing mindsets, but it's also about reorganizing resources, capabilities, the way you learn in an ongoing fashion as a business in order to create that differentiation that you might not even be able to map from someone else. It is really starting with that mindset that I've talked so much about. So to sum it up, I think the last one is coming here. Here it is. I see kind of 10 steps to get that going, and I think we have kind of been through most of it. First of all, you need to elevate the marketing function to the highest level. That's a very good starting point, because you need to have marketing to become a strategy discussion and not just a very silo-based vertical discussion of a function, but rather have marketing as something horizontal that encompasses everything within the organization. That, for a start, is a big endeavor if you get that right. Be bold, differentiate, aspirational, and involve all your stakeholders. We have also been through that. I've shown you Singapore Airlines, which is not only run by cabin crew, pilots, or a CEO. It is really an ecosystem that gels very well with everyone on the spot 24/7 in a lot of different time zones. Innovation is key, the balance of promise and delivery, the culture. And I think maybe the most important thing here is to keep it high, because as I said, arrogance and complacency can strike at any given time. And it's really important to raise that bar all the time. And there are multiple legacy stories about the chairman of Samsung, who is still very much involved. He's coming to work every morning, and he's scared about competition. He surely enjoys the journey, but he's not satisfied, because you know something can happen to the journey, the trajectory, the takeoff that you're going through. So you need to raise your bar all the time. Think about all the legacy brands that we have talked about today as well. A lot of them are running the risk of suddenly just lowering the bar a little bit, and that's where competition will strike, consumer taste will change, or whatever would happen. So the way I see it, as critical as I may have been on certain issues, I think Asia has a massive opportunity. Asia has an unprecedented opportunity now to step up, and I think over the next 5, 10, say even 15 years, we have a fantastic opportunity in Asia to step up, create the right mindsets, and create more brands. I don't think the future legacy brands necessarily just have to come from the global world. I mean the Western world, American brands, European brands that have fostered a lot of great brands in almost any category. Now I think it's time to step up. So as much as the world has been focusing on Asia, and in particular on China and India, and we know there's more to Asia than just China and India, I see a lot of entrepreneurs coming up, but I also see a lot of those kind of younger people coming back. And young in my mind is not 25-year-olds. Young people in Asian management and in Asian families, they are 40 or 50 years old. They have already come back, and I think they're going to make great changes. So if you're going to meet in another 5 or 10 years, being in Taiwan, being out there somewhere in Asia, I think Asia will create many more strong brands. And I'm very glad to be part of that journey. And I wish all of you great luck. Thanks very much.
谢谢，非常感谢 Mr. Martin Rowe 精彩的演讲 ，Thank you very much.